Mahek and Ansreen Bukhari. Just after midnight on a cold February night in 2022, a 21-year-old man dialed 999 from the passenger seat of a Skoda Fabia as it hurtled down the A46 in Leicestershire. He told the operator that a car behind was trying to run them off the road, that he was going to die. Minutes later, he did. What he did not know in those final seconds was that the woman who had ordered the ambush was the mother of the woman he had been sleeping with for 3 years, and that the daughter who had planned the chase, an influencer with hundreds of thousands of TikTok followers, had been messaging friends for weeks about getting him jumped. Ansreen Bukhari was 45, a British-Pakistani woman from Stoke-on-Trent, a wife, a mother. Saqib Hussain had been roughly 18 when their affair began. It lasted about 3 years. He said he had spent around £3,000 on her, and he wanted the money back. More than that, he had recordings, sexually explicit recordings of Ansreen, and he had started threatening to send them to her husband and to her son. Her daughter Mahek was 22. Online she went by Maybe fashion hauls, travel clips, mother-daughter sketches shot inside the family home in Stoke, polished reels about perfume and handbags, and the soft focus glamour of a girl with a big feed. In the weeks before the night on the A46, Mahek was using her phone to message friends about getting Saqib jumped. She wrote as if it were a simple favor she was lining up for her mother. On the night of February 11th, 2022, Saqib Hussain and his friend Mohammed Hashim Ijazuddin drove from Banbury up to a Tesco car park in Hamilton, Leicester. Ijazuddin was 21, and he had nothing to do with any of it. He was driving because Saqib had asked him for a lift. As Saqib understood it, the plan was simple. Meet Ansreen, collect the money, go home. He did not know the Bukharis had arrived with 7 associates in 2 cars, an Audi TT and a Seat Leon. The moment the 2 men in the Skoda realized the car park was a trap, they ran for the A46 dual carriageway. The seat chased them. Near 6 Hills, it rammed the Skoda at speeds exceeding 100 miles an hour. The Skoda struck a tree on the central reservation and caught fire. Both men died at the scene. Not one of the people in the 2 pursuing cars stopped. Saqib's final emergency call, his voice telling an operator he was about to die, would become the single most damning piece of evidence at the trial to come. Leicestershire police traced the vehicles through number plate cameras and CCTV within hours. A first trial at Leicester Crown Court collapsed because of jury irregularity. At the retrial in 2023, before Judge Timothy Spencer KC, the jury convicted Mahek, Ansreen, and 2 co-defendants of 2 counts of murder each. 3 other men were convicted of manslaughter. 1 was acquitted on September 1st, 2023. The sentences were read into the record. Mahek received life, with a minimum of 31 years and 8 months before she could even apply for parole. Her mother received life, with a minimum of 26 years and 9 months. From the bench, Judge Spencer described Mahek's pursuit of cheap online fame as having made her utterly self-obsessed. He described the ambush as calculated, organized, and cruel. He did not describe it as a crime of passion. The story did not end at sentencing. In October of 2025, the Court of Appeal, with Lord Justice Warby presiding, reduced Mahek's minimum term to 26 years and 285 days. The panel said the trial judge had given far too little weight to her youth and immaturity at 22. Ansreen had tried to appeal too, but dropped her case the day before the hearing. Her sentence stands. Both women are now held in separate English women's prisons. Under the reduced terms, parole consideration for each of them falls around the year 2049. Mahek, the lifestyle influencer whose feed is frozen in time, will be in her late 40s before she can even ask to be released. Her mother will be nearing 80. In a home in Banbury, the mother of Mohammed Hashimi Jazuddin still grieves a son who was behind the wheel that night only because his friend had asked him for a lift. 3,000 miles west, in a Missouri suburb, the poison came in a bottle of Gatorade, and the 21-year-old daughter who helped pour it had been writing down her predictions in a spiral notebook for months. Diane and Rachel Stott. In the summer of 2011, a 21-year-old woman in Springfield, Missouri, sat down with a spiral notebook and wrote what would later read like a prophecy. Within the next 2 months, she predicted, her father would die. Shortly after that, she wrote, her brother would be gone as well. At the bottom of a folded poem she tucked into her purse, she wrote that only the quiet ones would be left, her mother, her younger sister, and herself. Roughly 10 months later, the first prediction came true. 5 months after that, the second. If a Lutheran pastor had not made an anonymous phone call in June of 2013, the rest of Rachel Stott's notebook would almost certainly have come true too. Diane Stott was 50, a trained nurse and the organist at Redeemer Lutheran Church. Her husband Mark was 61, a blues guitarist working the local bar circuit. They had 4 children. Sean, the oldest, was 26 and on the autism spectrum. Sarah, 24, had recently finished university and was struggling under heavy student loan debt. Rachel, 21, was openly the family favorite. Brianna was 9, for reasons Diane later narrated in flat, almost bureaucratic sentences to a Springfield detective named Neil McCamus. She had come to despise her own family. She said she hated her husband's guts. She said Sean was worse than a pest. She resented Sarah for the debt hanging over the household. Methodically, she went online and bought the antifreeze, specifically the internet-sold kind, which at the time still lacked the bittering agent that manufacturers add to commercial antifreeze to stop children and pets from drinking it. Without that bitter additive, antifreeze has the sweetness of maple syrup. Mix it into a bottle of Gatorade and no one tastes it at all. On Easter Sunday, April 8, 2012, Mark Stout drank from a bottle of Gatorade in the family kitchen. Within hours, he was violently ill. He died not long after. The local coroner did not test for ethylene glycol. The cause of death was written up as natural. 5 months later, on September 2nd, Sean drank from a Coca-Cola his mother handed him. He too died. Again, no one tested for poison. Again, the death was written up as natural. 2 members of one family had died in the same home, inside the space of half a year, and no alarm bells had rung. Then, in June of 2013, Sarah collapsed. She was rushed to hospital with a brain bleed and failing kidneys. Doctors managed to save her, but only because someone outside the family had begun to pay attention. Diane had not organized any memorial for Sean. She was telling acquaintances she was planning a holiday to Florida, while Sarah lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. The pastor at Redeemer Lutheran, Jeff Sippy, made an anonymous call to the police on June 11th. Investigators pulled preserved tissue samples from the earlier autopsies and ran the tests that should have been run the first time. Ethylene glycol came back positive. On June 20th, 2013, Diane confessed. She described her resentments in the same calm, procedural tone she might have used to explain a nursing chart. Rachel held out longer, until detectives walked into the interview room with her own diary. She had written her mother's plans down before they happened. She had watched each prediction come true. She had not reported a thing. Detectives recovered the poem from her purse. the one ending with her mother, her younger sister, and herself as the only ones left. Brianna, the 9-year-old, had been the next intended target. Rachel took a plea. In May of 2015, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault in exchange for agreeing to testify against her mother. In March of 2016, she was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms plus 2 concurrent 20-year terms, with parole eligibility at roughly 42.5 years, putting her first hearing around the year 2058. Diane, to avoid the death penalty, entered what is called an Alford plea in January of 2016. She received 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Diane Stott, now in her mid-60s, sits in Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri. She still tells anyone who will listen that she is innocent, despite the recording of her own confession. Rachel is held at the Women's Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Vandalia. Sarah survived, but lives in assisted care with permanent neurological damage from what was put in her body. Brianna was placed with another family. Rachel's folded poem, the one that ended with her mother, her younger sister, and herself as the only ones left, is still in the Missouri case file. East of Missouri, in a red brick apartment complex in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, 5 bodies would be found stacked inside a single bedroom, and the 2 women responsible would try to tell police that demons had driven them to it. Shauna and Dominique Decree. On a February afternoon in 2019, a caseworker for Bucks County Children's Services stood outside apartment S7 at the Robert Morris Apartments in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, and asked a maintenance worker to unlock the door. She had already been here on Sunday, and no one had answered. Relatives had been pleading with her office for days. The rumors about what was happening inside the unit had grown strange, and then stranger. Talk of demons, talk of being followed, a household that seemed to have cut itself off from the rest of the family. The maintenance man turned the key. The caseworker stepped inside. What she found in the back bedroom of that small apartment would take the Bucks County District Attorney weeks to put into words. And even then, he would admit that no one was any closer to understanding why. Shauna Decree was 45. Her daughter Dominique was 19. The 2 of them lived in Unit S7. By February of 2019, the apartment had filled up. Shauna's older daughter, Naira Smith, 25, was staying there. So was Shauna's 13-year-old son, Damon Jr. So was Shauna's sister, Jamila Campbell, 42, and Jamila's 9-year-old twin daughters, Imani and Erica Allen. 7 people in 2 bedrooms. A household drawing inward, losing contact with the outside world. Shauna had pulled Damon Jr. out of school weeks earlier. Relatives later described phone calls that had grown disjointed and paranoid. The family had been talking about spiritual attack, about demons, about ideas that seemed to have arrived through late-night online reading and settled heavily on top of a household already under strain. Between the 23rd and the 25th of February, all 5 of the extended family members lost their lives inside that apartment. The caseworker's first attempt to check in on Saturday the 23rd had come too late. When she returned on Monday the 25th, shortly before 4 in the afternoon, and the maintenance man opened the door, the officers who arrived to back her up found the apartment in chaos. In a back bedroom, they found 5 bodies stacked together. Naira Smith, Damon Decree Jr., Imani and Erica Allen, Jamila Campbell. In a different bedroom, Shauna and Dominique were alive. Dominique had fresh, superficial wounds to her own neck. The Bucks County Coroner's Office completed its findings on March 29th. 4 of the 5 had died by what the coroner called homicidal asphyxia. Jamila Campbell had been strangled with a ligature. Every one of the 5 deaths was ruled a homicide. In interviews, the 2 women first tried to blame strangers. Dominique described an unknown man who had broken in. Shauna blamed her sister's boyfriend and 2 other men. When those stories collapsed, both of them began to tell a different one. They told investigators that all 5 of the people in the other bedroom had wanted to die, that the household had been talking about dying, that what had taken place inside the apartment had started as a pact, a plan to leave the world together, and had tipped over into something only 2 of the 7 survived. Their accounts conflicted over who had actually put their hands on whom, but both acknowledged direct involvement in multiple deaths. The Bucks County District Attorney, Matt Weintraub, told reporters the case had every feature of a murder-suicide pact, except that only the people meant to carry it out were still alive. He said plainly that in the harsh light of day, they were no closer to understanding why. Both women were arrested on the 25th and held without bail. Both were charged with 5 counts of criminal homicide and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. In Pennsylvania, the law provides for a special plea called guilty, but mentally ill. It allows the state to hold someone fully responsible for what they have done, while also acknowledging that severe mental illness was in the room with them. On September 28, 2020, before President Judge Wallace H. Bateman, Jr. in Doylestown, both women entered that plea. Multiple experts in separate mental health evaluations had concluded that Shauna and Dominique were both severely mentally ill at the time of the offenses, and that finding took the death penalty off the table. Judge Bateman sentenced each of them to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus the conspiracy count on top. Weintraub told the courtroom that without that finding, both women would have faced execution. Shauna and Dominique are now inside the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, almost certainly at State Correctional Institution Muncie, the state's primary women's facility. Neither has any path to parole. There has been no appellate activity. The case has not been reopened. The reason 5 people were stacked in a back bedroom of apartment S7 remains, to this day, what the district attorney said it was. A question no one seems able to answer. 17 years before that caseworker turned her key in that lock, another family had already staged their own solution to a difficult marriage. They had placed the pistol in the hand of a 15-year-old girl. Joan and Elizabeth Shannon. Major David Ray Shannon had been home from Fort Bragg long enough to be asleep in his own bed when his 15-year-old daughter walked into the bedroom carrying a 9mm pistol. She was wearing surgical gloves. She was wearing an extra layer of sweat clothes, on her mother's careful instructions, so that no gunshot residue would end up on her skin. She stood over the man who had formerly adopted her when she was a small child and fired twice. Once to the forehead, once to the chest. Then she went back to her mother. A few hours later, in the early morning of July 23, 2002, Joan Shannon picked up the phone and called 911. She told the operator that an intruder had come into their home on Galloway Drive and attacked them both in their sleep. Joan Shannon was 41. She worked as a loan receptionist at the Fort Bragg Credit Union. She had married David in 1991, and he had adopted her 2 daughters from a prior marriage, giving them his name. In the early months of 2002, Joan had begun an affair with a man named Jeffrey Wilson. They had met through a swingers club the Shannons attended together. David, a United States Army computer specialist, was insured through a policy worth $700,000. Prosecutors would later lay out for the jury, in careful order, the lengths to which Joan Shannon had gone before she ever handed her daughter a gun. First, she had tried poisoning her husband. That failed. Then she had attempted to locate a hitman to do the job for her. That did not come together either. In the end, she turned to the only person in the household who was fully under her control, her 15-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. She gave Elizabeth the gun. She gave Elizabeth the gloves. She told her exactly what to wear and exactly where to stand. First responders arriving at the Galloway Drive house in the early morning of July 23rd noticed details that did not fit. Joan was not tearful. Joan had no blood on her, although she claimed she had been sleeping inches from a man who had just been shot. There were no real signs of an intrusion. Elizabeth, who was supposed to be frightened and distraught along with her mother, was elsewhere in the house. A friend of Elizabeth's had stayed over that night, a girl named Vera Thompson. When detectives sat her down, Vera began to talk, and then she began to cry, and then she told them what had been planned inside the house in the days before. Investigators went looking for Elizabeth. They found her hiding under a couch at a nearby mobile home park. When a detective told her David Shannon had not survived, she looked back at him and asked, almost without inflection, whether he had died. It was one of the small details the prosecution would keep returning to. Elizabeth took a plea in June of 2004. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy. The deal required her to testify against her mother. In exchange, she received a sentence with a minimum of 25 years and a maximum of 31 years and 5 months. She had been 15 when the shooting happened. She would enter her 20s, her 30s, and a good piece of her 40s inside North Carolina Department of Corrections custody. Joan's trial began in Cumberland County Superior Court on August 15, 2005. Her own daughter took the stand as the prosecution's central witness. On August 31st, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, guilty of accessory after the fact. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole, plus at least 13 more years stacked on top. Joan appealed. In 2007, in a decision North Carolina lawyers still cite, State v. Shannon, the State Court of Appeals affirmed her convictions, but issued a new rule about how prosecutors must disclose their interviews with key witnesses. The opinion changed procedure across the state. It did nothing to change Joan's outcome. Joan Shannon, now in her mid-60s, is held at Anson Correctional Institution in Polkton, North Carolina. She will not be released. Elizabeth, now in her late 30s, is at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh. Her earliest possible release date is in the year 2029. She will walk out if she walks out, having spent more of her life inside prison than outside it. Buried in the long paper trail of the Shannon case is a detail a prosecutor at sentencing came back to more than once. That the mother in this case had tried poison and tried to hire a killer. And only when those avenues closed had she picked up the phone and handed the job to her own teenage child. Halfway around the world, on a cattle property in rural New South Wales, 3 women in the same family would build a plan of their own and would refer to themselves in phone calls that were being recorded all along as a triangle. Helen Ryan and Coralie Coulter. Kalamanda was roughly 1,000 acres of grazing country outside Tamworth, in the New England tablelands of New South Wales. Jeffrey Ryan had spent most of his working life on that land. He had built the herd, fenced the paddocks, outlasted drought years. By the spring of 2009, the farm was worth about 1.1 million Australian dollars. And Jeffrey, at 48, was pulling his life away from his wife of 15 years. He had told her he was ending the marriage. He had rewritten his will so that Helen would no longer receive the lion's share. What he did not know as he stepped outside his own homestead on the evening of October 29th was that the question of the farm had already been settled. In whispered phone calls between his wife, his mother-in-law, and his sister-in-law, 3 women who described themselves, when they thought no one was listening, as a triangle that could not be broken as long as everyone stuck to the same story. Helen Ryan was 49. She and Jeffrey had a 13-year-old daughter together. Her mother, Coralie Coulter, was 70. Helen's sister was Ganine Coulter. The 3 of them, detectives would later establish, had arrived at a single decision over the course of that year: that Jeffrey was not going to take Kalamanda from Helen. Not in life, not in divorce, not through a revised will. The man Helen hired was Kenneth Brooks, a 45-year-old from Cessnock, roughly 3 hours' drive southeast of the farm. The agreed fee was 30,000 Australian dollars. In September of 2009, Coralie lent her daughter 10,000. Helen added another 5. The $15,000 down payment changed hands at a rest stop on the New England Highway, passed from Helen to Brooks in a car park beside the road. On the evening of October 29, 2009, Brooks drove to Kalamanda with a shotgun. He waited for Jeffrey to step outside the homestead. He fired once. A single shotgun wound to the abdomen proved fatal. A neighbor found the body the following day, lying on the property Jeffrey had spent his lifetime building. The New South Wales detectives who took over the investigation did something simple and patient. They started listening. For months, they intercepted the telephone calls of everyone in the Coulter family. They began to hear Helen and Coralie and Ganine talk about the triangle. The idea that the 3 of them formed a shape that could not be broken as long as no one said anything out of turn. Detectives heard Helen reassure her mother. They heard Ganine ask careful questions about what might happen next. They heard the 3 women coordinate their story in real time. In December of 2010, more than a year after Jeffrey's death, Helen drove down to Cessnock carrying the second half of the payment. A surveillance team was waiting. They watched her hand the money to Brooks. They arrested Brooks and his partner Jolene Farrell first. And within hours, they picked up Helen, Coralie, and Ganine. In interviews, Helen tried to shrink her role. She said she had only wanted her husband roughed up, not killed. She blamed her sister for pushing the plan further than she had ever intended. Coralie, 70 years old, told police she had lent the money without knowing what it would be used for. The jury did not believe either of them. At trial in the New South Wales Supreme Court in 2012, Crown Prosecutor Terry Thorpe described Helen as a woman scorned, a wife who had decided that if she could not keep her husband, she would at least keep his land. The jurors deliberated for roughly 3 hours. Both Helen and Coralie were convicted of murder. Kenneth Brooks, the shooter, was separately convicted and received a 38-year sentence. Ganine Coulter had already pleaded guilty to conspiracy. Justice Megan Latham from the bench sentenced Helen to a maximum of 36 years with a non-parole period of 27. She said Helen had deliberately and methodically plotted to have her husband killed, and that she was far from the cowering and terrorized wife she had presented to the court. Coralie received a maximum of 27 years with a non-parole period of 18. Justice Latham noted, almost in passing, that a woman of 70 walking into a sentence like that was likely to die in custody. Appeals to the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal went nowhere. Coralie Coulter, now roughly 87, remains inside a New South Wales women's correctional facility, with parole eligibility only reachable well into her 90s. Helen Ryan, now in her mid-60s, will not be eligible for release until roughly the year 2037. Jeffrey's mother, Marie Ryan, told a reporter outside court, at a moment when she could have said anything she liked, that the women who had killed her son were very evil people. Calamonda, the cattle property all three of them had gambled their freedom to keep inside the family, has long since passed into other hands. As tangled as the Ryan case looks on paper, it at least had a shape people recognize: a wife, a will, and a man who had to go before the paperwork did. The 4 cases left on this list are harder to sit with. A custody battle in California that ended with a 91-year-old woman in a garden shed. A Vermont liquor store owner and her daughter who walked into the bedroom with a pistol. A basement in suburban Maryland that the responding officers are not going to shake. And a Los Angeles house call where the weapon was a syringe full of silicone. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Rosa Hill and May Lee. On a January evening in 2009, in a house on Peppertree Lane in Dublin, California, a 91-year-old woman named Selma Hill opened a door she should not have opened. 2 women in dark clothes were standing in her kitchen. They had driven into Dublin that afternoon with a taser, a collapsible baton, handcuffs, a pocket saw, a hacksaw, a hunting knife, a samurai sword, rope, a crossbow, an unloaded handgun, and an item that prosecutors, at the trial 18 months later, would describe as a throat cutter. Selma Hill was not the person they had come to kill. She was in their way. By the time her step-grandson arrived home with his 2-year-old daughter in his arms, Selma was in a garbage bin in a shed at the back of her own property. And the real target had walked straight into the ambush his former wife had been preparing for roughly 9 months. Rosa Pui Hill was 36, a former Silicon Valley IT worker, and by any honest reading of the family court record, a woman who had lost a custody battle she could not accept losing. Her estranged husband, Eric Hill, a social services worker, had been granted sole legal custody and about 85% physical custody of their young daughter after a family court investigation looked into Rosa's molestation allegations against him and found them unsupported. Eric had been staying at his step-grandmother Selma's home. Rosa's mother, May Lee, was 57, and she worked for Alameda County Social Services, the same agency that had years earlier introduced Eric to her daughter. Rosa's father, Ping Lee, was also part of the plot. When Alameda County investigators later searched the family's home, they found what they would call, for the rest of the case, a kill kit. Beside it was a sheaf of handwritten notes under the heading Operation Custody. Searches on the home computer included entries for traceless suicide, for homemade silencer, for how to strangle, for how to get away with murder. Alameda County Prosecutor Casey Bates told the jury the plan had been taking shape for about 9 months. On the evening of January 7th, 2009, Ping dropped Rosa and May near Selma's home and drove off to wait. The 2 women, dressed in black, entered the house. They tased the 91-year-old. They beat her. They strangled her with their hands. Autopsy findings would catalog roughly 23 separate wounds and defensive bruising across her knuckles. When Selma was dead, they wrapped her in sheets, carried her body outside, and placed her in a garbage bin in a locked backyard shed. Then they waited for Eric. He came through the door carrying his 2-year-old daughter. He did not yet know Selma was missing. May attacked him first, driving a collapsible baton across his throat and pinning it there while Rosa aimed the unloaded handgun at his head. Eric fought. He broke free for long enough that a neighbor, hearing the crackle of a taser through the walls, had already placed a 911 call. Responding officers arrived to find the toddler safe in an upstairs bathroom, Ping ducking inside a car parked a block away, and Selma Hill's body in the shed. Rosa and May were tried in Alameda County Superior Court in front of Judge Kenneth M. Burr. The jury convicted both on June 28, 2011. On August 29th, Rosa received 25 years to life, plus a consecutive life term with a firearm enhancement. May received 25 years to life, plus a consecutive life term. Judge Burr told the courtroom this was one of the most carefully planned crimes he had seen in 35 years of practicing law. Ping pleaded guilty to accessory and burglary and received 4 years. 4 years after trial, the First District Court of Appeal issued a decision known as People versus Hill. The panel affirmed Rosa's convictions in full. It reversed May's first-degree murder conviction for the death of Selma Hill on the basis of instructional error. The jury had not been told that felony murder liability cannot attach to an accomplice whose assistance begins only after the killing is complete. May's attempted murder life term for the attack on Eric and her burglary conviction both remained intact. Both women are held at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Rosa's parole suitability hearing is on the calendar for July of 2029. May, now roughly 72, had a hearing scheduled for March of 2025. But the outcome has not been publicly confirmed. Eric Hill survived. The toddler he was carrying through his own front door that evening is now approaching her 20th birthday. Raised in the custody of the father, her mother and grandmother went to extraordinary lengths to remove from her life. In the house on Pepper Tree Lane, the kitchen where a 91-year-old woman fought with her bare knuckles against 2 attackers half her age, is what prosecutors now point to when they need to explain how a custody grudge becomes a 9-month plan. 2,000 miles east of Dublin, in a small town near the Canadian border in northern Vermont, a liquor store, a drug dealer, and a family at the end of its rope would leave a man's body on a back porch for most of a month. Erica and Carmen Gutilla. In Highgate, Vermont, one night in the autumn of 2017, a 31-year-old woman named Erica Gutilla walked out of her mother's state liquor store and slipped a small pistol into her waistband. Her mother had handed it to her. The two of them, together with Erica's father, had been drinking in the store after hours. They were driving home now, to a house on Charles Circle where a 35-year-old man from Brooklyn named Troy Ford was asleep in Erica's bedroom. Ford had spent the preceding months raping her, beating her, smashing a liquor bottle over her head, and telling the family that if they pushed him, he would set the house on fire with all of them inside. On the way to the car, Erica told her mother, in the tone a person might use to suggest bringing an umbrella, that she was taking the gun along in case he was really bad tonight. She would be the one to pull the trigger. The body would sit in a garbage bin on the back porch of the family home for roughly the next month. Carmen Gutilla was 60. She ran the Vermont State Liquor Store in Swanton. Her daughter Erica, 31, had lived for years with a heavy methamphetamine and crack cocaine habit. Erica's father, Michael Gutilla, had developed a heroin dependency that started with a workplace injury. Troy Ford had talked his way into the Gutilla household several months earlier by offering drugs in exchange for a room. By autumn of 2017, the arrangement had slid into something closer to occupation. Witnesses in the eventual court record described Ford as a tyrant inside the house. He beat Erica. He raped her. He smashed a liquor bottle over her head. He told the family more than once that if they crossed him, they would burn. On the night that ended it, after hours of drinking at the Swanton liquor store, the three Gutillas drove back to Highgate. Erica walked into her own bedroom with her mother's pistol. Ford was asleep. She fired one close-range shot into his head. The cover-up began immediately. Erica and her new boyfriend, Corey Kasani, wrapped the body in carpet and plastic. Rather than try to move it at once, They stored it in a garbage bin on the back porch of the Gutilla home. The bin sat there through late autumn frost, through the first snow, for roughly a month. In December of 2017, Erica and Kasani finally hauled the remains from the porch to an abandoned playground off Darlene Drive, covered the carpet and plastic bundle with pine branches, and walked away. Dog walkers found what was left of Troy Ford on May 5, 2018. The Vermont State Police had already been tipped off. In April, an inmate named Edward Bennett had contacted investigators to say Erica Gutilla had been boasting, in the way an addict sometimes boasts when a secret has outgrown its hiding place, about the shooting on Charles Circle. Detectives worked the story backwards through Erica's siblings and through a recorded phone call. And by the time the remains turned up in the woods off Darlene Drive, they already knew whose they were. Carmen Gutilla was confronted at the University of Vermont Medical Center on May 6th. She told Detective Sergeant Angela Baker, in one of the earliest honest statements in the case file, that the situation inside the house had been going on for 2 years with this man, and that he had done terrible things. Initial charges were serious: first-degree murder for Erica, aiding first-degree murder for Carmen. The case dragged on for nearly 4 years as plea negotiations broke down and restarted. On March 10, 2022, both women changed their pleas. Erica pleaded to second-degree murder. Carmen pleaded to accessory to murder. On May 6th of the same year, in Franklin County Superior Court, Judge Martin Maley ruled the two had played equal roles in the death of Troy Ford and handed down identical sentences. 20 years to life, all suspended except 10 years to serve. With credit for the 4 years already behind them, Corey Kasani had already received 3 to 7 years back in November of 2019. Both women remain at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility in South Burlington, Vermont's only women's prison. Under the state's Good Time Credit rules, WCAX has reported that either or both could potentially be released as early as 2027. Without those credits, parole eligibility would mature in roughly 2028. It is one of the few stories on this list where the women involved are likely to walk out, return to a community, and attempt the rest of their lives. It is also one of the few where the sentencing record suggests that the judge and the jury had decided the man they killed had made the house he lived in genuinely uninhabitable. 600 miles south of Highgate, in Prince George's County, Maryland, a confrontation over a stolen credit card would end inside a family basement that a county state's attorney would later use as the founding example for a new task force on domestic violence. Candace Craig and Salia Hardy. On the afternoon of June 2, 2023, Prince George's County police officers stood at the front door of a house on Hill Road in Landover Hills, Maryland, responding to a welfare check called in by a worried nephew. The 44-year-old woman who answered the door let them in without resistance. They walked through the main floor, then down the stairs into the basement. The smell reached them somewhere in the descent. 3 trash bags were on the concrete floor. One had slumped open. Inside was part of what remained of the homeowner's own 71-year-old mother, who had been missing for about 10 days. Behind the bags, investigators would eventually recover the chainsaw. Margaret Craig was 71. She had worked her entire adult life. She lived on Social Security and a pension. She owned the house on Hill Road. 3 generations of the family shared it. Her daughter, Candace Raquel Craig, 44, who was supposed to act as her caretaker, her granddaughter, Salia Margaret Hardy, 19, a young woman with a developmental disability whom prosecutors would later describe as easily coerced, and Candace's 3 young children. Margaret's Social Security deposits and pension payments went into the household accounts that kept everyone afloat. On May 23, 2023, Margaret confronted her daughter about fraudulent charges on her credit card. Prosecutors would later tell the jury Margaret had threatened to report her daughter to the police. During that confrontation, Margaret lost her life by asphyxiation. She was found with a trash bag over her head. At sentencing, the Prince George's County State's Attorney, Aisha Braveboy, described her as a giving, caring, loving, compassionate, and understanding woman who had been killed by the daughter she had given a home. The next day, Salia Hardy returned to the house and found her grandmother's body in a blue bin inside her own bedroom. What happened across the following days, prosecutors would later describe as very deliberate. Candace and Salia used a chainsaw to dismember the remains. They drove to a hardware store and purchased gas cans, charcoal, and a lighter. In the backyard, they attempted to burn pieces of the body on the family barbecue grill and in a separate bonfire, using kitchen seasonings to try to mask the odor. Neighbors later told reporters they had smelled something strange across those days and had not understood what it was. Prosecutors said the motive was financial. Candace wanted her mother's benefit checks to keep arriving. When officers finally walked down the basement stairs on June 2nd, they recovered 9 trash bags and several paint cans full of remains. They recovered the chainsaw. Candace Craig and Salia Hardy were held without bond within days. Hardy, whose role had been primarily in the cover-up, took a plea to accessory after the fact and agreed to testify against her mother. Candace Craig's trial began on October 24, 2024, in Prince George's County Circuit Court, prosecuted by Assistant State's Attorneys Julia Hall, Shauna Coleman, and Jessica Garth. In December, Hardy took the stand. Observers in the courtroom described her tone as matter-of-fact. She walked the jury through buying the gas can and the charcoal. She walked them through the dismemberment. Asked why she had done any of it, she gave one answer: because her mother had asked her to. The medical examiner testified Margaret had died at the hands of another person. On November 1st, 2024, the jury returned its verdict on all counts: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, improper disposal. After less than an hour of deliberation, on February 19, 2025, Candace Craig received life without the possibility of parole, plus 3 additional years for tampering and 1 for improper disposal. Judge Karen Mason sentenced Salia Hardy to time served, which by then amounted to more than 500 days in pretrial custody, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Candace Craig is now in the custody of the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, most likely at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup. She has no path to release. Salia Hardy will remain on supervised probation through approximately December of 2029. State's Attorney Braveboy has used the Craig case in public remarks as the founding example for the Prince George's Collaborative to End Family Violence, citing a jump in county family-related homicides from 14 in 2022 to 22 in 2023. On Hill Road, the house that once held 3 generations of one family sits empty. The last case on this list belongs to a pair of women in Southern California who never used a knife and never pulled a trigger, and who have nevertheless been tied to the deaths of at least 2 people. One of them, a Hollywood actress, who died more than 5 years after a Los Angeles judge warned the older of the 2 women from the bench that her hands were already dangerous enough to carry a murder charge. Libby Adame and Alicia Galaz. In a private home in Sherman Oaks, California, on October 15, 2019, a 26-year-old adult industry performer named Carissa Rajpal lay face down while a mother and daughter she had already paid thousands of dollars worked over her lower body with a large-gauge syringe. It was her 3rd appointment with the pair. When they finished, Carissa sat up and began to struggle for breath. A friend in the room attempted mouth-to-mouth and begged the two women to call 911. Libby Adame, 51, told the friend that the client would be fine. By the time paramedics were finally called, by the time they arrived, by the time doctors at the emergency room began working on her, Libby Adame and her 23-year-old daughter Alicia Galaz were already out of the house, driving back to Riverside, and no one treating the dying woman had any idea what had been injected into her body. Carissa Rajpal was pronounced dead less than 3 hours after she had lain down for the procedure. Libby Adame was known inside an underground cosmetics circle as La Tia, the butt lady. For roughly a decade, she had run an unlicensed silicone injection operation with her daughter Alicia Galaz. They charged between $3,500 and $4,500 per session, against perhaps $10,000 to $15,000 at a licensed clinic. Neither held any medical credential. Galaz had been in the room during an earlier fatality at a Southgate salon in 2018. Carissa Rajpal, born in South Africa and living in Los Angeles as a social media performer, had gone back to them a third time. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office determined that Carissa had died from a silicone pulmonary embolism, acute cardiopulmonary dysfunction caused by silicone that had migrated from the injection site into her bloodstream and traveled to her lungs. The manner of death was homicide. Investigators noted on the record that street-level silicone operators often adulterate medical-grade product with hardware store caulk. LAPD Valley Bureau Homicide Detective Robert Dinlocker ran the case. Deputy Chief Alan Hamilton pointed out, when the arrests came, that neither defendant had any medical training. When the women were finally taken into custody on August 5, 2021, approximately 100 other former clients came forward. At trial in Los Angeles County Superior Court in March of 2024, the jury acquitted both of second-degree murder, but convicted both of involuntary manslaughter, plus 3 counts of practicing medicine without certification for Adame and 2 for Galaz. On sentencing in April of 2024, Judge George G. Lomelli imposed 4 years and 4 months on Adame and 3 years and 8 months on Galaz. Applying electronic monitoring time they had already served against their sentences, he released both of them back onto the street the same day. From the bench, Lomelli told Libby Adame plainly that she was now on notice, and that if she kept injecting and anyone else died, she would face a murder charge. The warning proved exact. On March 24, 2025, 58-year-old actress Cindiana Santangelo, known to older audiences from the sitcom Married with Children and from the Young MC music video for Bust a Move, lost her life at her home in Malibu after Libby Adame injected her. Adame was arrested on May 12, 2025, while still on probation for the earlier death. In downtown Los Angeles, Deputy District Attorney Lee Cernock secured a second-degree murder conviction on October 9, 2025. On November 5th, Judge Sam Ota sentenced Adame to 15 years to life, walking the courtroom through the same mechanism the coroner had described 2 years before. Silicone migrating from an injection site into the bloodstream, into the lungs. A restitution hearing is set for May 5, 2026. The defense has signaled plans to appeal. Alicia Galaz was not charged in the Santangelo matter. She remains at liberty. Libby Adame, now 55, is inside the California state prison system, with parole eligibility falling somewhere around the year 2040. Carissa Rajpal's mother, Eureka Bobie, stood in front of a judge at the 2024 sentencing and asked the only thing she could ask at that point, that the woman who had killed her daughter never harm another soul. By the time those words were spoken into the record, the clock was already running down on the house call in Malibu that would prove her right. 9 cases, and in every single one, a mother, a daughter, or both were part of the plan. If one of these stuck with you more than the rest, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.